Hello everyone, welcome to week 4 lecture videos once again. In the last few videos in this week, we have learned how to calculate duration and also that the duration measure has economic meaning as it indicates the interest sensitivity or elasticity of an asset or liability's value. For financial institutions, the major relevance of duration is as a measure of managing interest rate risk exposure. Also important is duration's role in allowing the financial institutions to immunize its balance sheet or some subset of the balance sheet against interest rate risk. So in this video and in the next, we will discuss how we calculate interest rate exposure of a financial institution using this duration and how they can immunize against this interest rate risk exposure. So first of all, duration can be used to find out the duration gap. Okay, so to calculate this, first of all, we will calculate the duration of an asset portfolio. In the last videos, we have learned how we calculate duration for an individual asset or liability. Now, once we have duration for individual asset or liabilities, we can calculate duration for asset portfolio and we can calculate duration for liability portfolio. So you can see that duration of asset portfolio is the duration of individual asset multiplied by its weight in the asset portfolio. So in the first case, you can see this is duration of asset A multiplied by the weight of asset A in the asset portfolio. This is duration of asset 2 and multiplied by the weight of asset 2 in the asset portfolio. And this continues, and as we sum them up, we get the duration of asset portfolio, and similarly, we get duration of liability portfolio. And once we have this duration of asset portfolio and liability portfolio, as we deduct duration of liabilities portfolio from the duration of asset portfolio, we get the duration gap. This is how we find it out. Duration of asset minus duration of liabilities is the duration gap. Now, one point is the change in asset and liability values for a given change in interest rate can be written using this equation. Now, remember that this equation is nothing new. You can remember an equation we have seen earlier. Here it is. So you can see that price change divided by price is duration, is interest rate change divided by 1 plus R. Now, this equation is the same. So what simply happened is, let's say, is delta A divided by A should be, I will just erase this one for example, should be duration into delta R divided by 1 plus R. So this A has been moved to here. Okay, so this is simply a rearrangement of that equation I just showed you in the earlier slide. So the change in asset value for a change in interest rate should be equal to the asset portfolio duration multiplied by the value of the asset into interest rate change divided by 1 plus R. And similarly, the change in liability value or liability prices of the liability portfolio should be equal to the duration of the liability portfolio multiplied by value of liabilities into change in interest rate. Now, how do we calculate this one? I mean the duration gap, asset duration minus liability duration. So you understand that from the balance sheet equation is asset minus liability equals to equity, or we also call it net worth. So asset minus liability is equals to equity. Similarly, the duration of asset and duration of liabilities, as we have the similar concept. Now what we can do is delta asset minus delta liabilities. That means a change in the value of asset minus change in the value of liabilities should be equal to change in the value of equity. Okay, or value of net worth. So value of equity, change in the value of equity should be change in asset value, which is the first one, and change in liability values for a change in interest rate. Okay, so this is essentially the change in equity value for a change in asset value and for a change in liability value. Now, if we rearrange this equation, we get is a change in equity value for a change in interest rate is the duration of the asset portfolio, duration of liability portfolio multiplied by K. K is the leverage ratio, which is liability divided by asset, into the value of asset multiplied by change in interest rate divided by 1 plus R. So this equation is simply the rearrangement of this equation. Now you understand that how much the net worth will change for a given change in interest rate is a function of these three factors. Okay, that is the liability adjusted duration gap, the size of the asset portfolio, and the size of the interest rate shock. Okay, so a change in equity value is a function of these three factors. Now let's understand this using an example. Let's say a simplified balance sheet of a financial institution where asset is $100, liability is $90, and equity $10. So assume that the average duration of asset is 5 years, average duration of liability is 3 years. The current interest rate is 10%, but expected to increase to 11%. That means interest rate is expected to increase by 1%. So this 1% change in interest rate, I mean 1% rise in interest rate, how that affect the net worth or equity of the financial institution. So you can remember the formula minus, this is the duration of asset, minus this is K, if you can remember, this K, and then it is the duration of liabilities, which is 3, multiplied by the size of the asset portfolio, which is $100, you can remember, multiplied by change in interest rate, which is 1%, divided by 1 plus interest rate. Okay, so if we solve this equation, we get is the minus 2.09. It means that for a 1% rise in interest rate, this financial institution's equity will decline by $2.09 million. I mean, net worth will decline by $2.09 million. Now, what would happen if instead of 1% interest rate increases, interest rate decreases by 1%? Once again, there will be symmetric impact. That means if interest rate decreases by 1%, then equity value will increase by $2.09 million. I mean, net worth will increase by $2.09 million. Now, how financial institution can reduce this interest rate risk exposure, can reduce this interest rate risk? So you can remember that there are 3 components. One is the leverage adjusted duration gap, asset size, and the interest rate shock. So the strategies are, first of all, they can reduce the duration of assets. Okay, for example, you can see here duration of asset is 5 years and duration of liability is 3 years. So if we multiply these 3 in by this 0.9, what we get is 2.7. Now, if the duration of asset portfolio is also 2.7, then the whole part will become, this part will become 0, so whole part will become 0. That means for a change in interest rate, there will be no change in the equity value. It means that the financial institution will be immunized against any interest rate shock or interest rate changes. So one strategy could be reduce the asset duration from 5 years to 2.7 years. The second one is we can do 2 things simultaneously. One is reduce the asset duration of the asset portfolio to 4 years and increase the duration of the liability portfolio to 4.4 years. And once again, it will become 0, and there will be no change in the equity value for a change in an interest rate. And last of all, we can increase the leverage from 9 to 0.95 and also increase the duration of the liability from 3 years to 5.26 years. Once again, it will make this part 0, so whole part 0, and the financial institution's equity will not change for a change in interest rate. So in this video, we essentially discussed how we can calculate the interest rate risk exposure of an entire financial institution and what strategies they can take to reduce interest rate risk exposure. That's the end of this video. Thank you very much.